The wind in Ash Hollow had a way of carrying whispers. It didn't matter if they started in the back room of Muck Cafferty's General Store or in the dark corner of the saloon. By the time they reached the far end of Main Street, they'd grown teeth, and more often than not, those teeth bit into one name, Evelyn Graves. The townsfolk never called her by just Evelyn anymore. She was the widow in black, as much a part of the town's lore as the hanging tree on the ridge or the river that dried up every summer. They said she was cursed. They said the ground she walked on seemed to die under her boots. They said her late husband hadn't just died, he'd been helped along. Some claimed she poisoned him. Others claimed he went mad from the cold look in her eyes. But for all their talk, none of them knew the truth, and none dared to ask Dot Every. Morning at dawn, she stepped out onto her porch dressed head to toe in black, the long, flowing skirts, the fitted jacket with brass buttons, the wide-brimmed hat casting her face in shadow. Even her gloves were black, stitched fine enough to look delicate, but strong enough for work. She carried herself like a woman who'd learned the hard way that softness was a liability. If she went to town, she moved with a calm, deliberate stride, ignoring the stares that trailed her every step. The black wasn't just mourning, it was armor, a message as clear as a posted sign. Stay back. Children gave her a wide berth. They'd peek from behind barrels or fences when she passed, clutching each other's arms, daring one another to get closer. The bolder ones whispered that if you looked her straight in the eye for too long, you'd dream of graveyards. The mothers hissed at them to hush, then crossed the street before the widow could walk by. It wasn't that Evelyn had ever raised her voice to a child or done anyone harm in town. It was simply that people believed she could. And in a place where belief could be more dangerous than truth, that was enough. Her ranch sat on the far side of the creek, a good mile from the last clapboard house in Ash Hollow. Folks said the land was as tough and unyielding as she was, nothing but wind-bitten grass, stubborn mesquite, and rocks so hard you couldn't sink a fence post without cursing the sky. Yet somehow, the widow in black managed to keep it thriving. Her cattle were healthy, her fences mended, and her well never seemed to run dry even when the summer scorched everything else into dust. No one could figure how she did it, and the not knowing only deepened the unease around her name. On Sundays, while the rest of the town filled the pews, Evelyn stayed home. The church ladies took this as proof of their suspicions that she was godless or worse. In truth, she simply had no patience for their side glances, or the way their prayers for her soul felt more like accusations than blessings. Her faith, if she had any left, was private. Her conversations were few. Her friends? None that anyone could name. She had been living this way for 10 years since her husband's death. 10 years of black skirts and locked gates, 10 years of building her walls higher and higher until no one could climb them. At night, when the wind rattled the windows and the coyotes called from the ridge, she would sometimes stand at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the empty chair across from her. There were no pictures on the walls, no trinkets on the shelves, nothing that gave away who she was before the black took over. The woman she had been once was buried with her husband, and she wasn't digging her up. People in Ash Hollow didn't realize that Evelyn Graves didn't enjoy their fear. She didn't feed off it. She endured it, the way one endures a long drought knowing that complaining won't bring rain. Fear was useful. It kept the wrong kind of men from sniffing around her ranch. It kept her business her own. And most of all, it kept anyone from getting close enough to hurt her again. Because real hurt, wasn't something Evelyn feared. She'd already lived through the worst of it. But trust? That was something she no longer knew how to give. So life went on in the same quiet, lonely rhythm. The widow in black would ride into town once every few weeks for supplies, speaking only when necessary, paying an exact coin. and leaving before anyone could find the courage to strike up more than 2 sentences with her. Then she'd disappear, back across the creek, swallowed by her stretch of land until her next rare appearance. To the people of Ash Hollow, she was more shadow than flesh, a figure in the distance. A warning. No one could have guessed that her story was about to change, or that the change would come not from some bold stranger blowing in on the stagecoach, nor from the town's constant gossip finally wearing her down, but from a man who'd been in Ash Hollow for 12 years without once giving her more than a passing thought. A man who would see her in a way no one else had. A man who would one day call her something she hadn't been called in over a decade: beautiful. Caleb Hart had been in Ash Hollow for 12 years, though you wouldn't know it by the way people talked about him, mostly because they didn't. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention, nor did he want it. In a town where most folks kept their noses in everyone else's business, Caleb somehow stayed clear of the gossip mill. He was the sort of presence you noticed only when you realized you hadn't seen him for a while, and then, when you finally did, you felt as though he'd been there all along, leaning quietly against a hitching post, his hat low over his brow. He had come to Ash Hollow in his 20s with nothing but a saddle, a mule, and a half-decent herd he'd scraped together by breaking horses for other ranchers along the trail. No one knew much about the life he'd left behind, and he never offered up stories. He bought a stretch of land on the north side of the Valley Rocky, wind-scoured country most men turned down, and slowly, stubbornly turned it into a working ranch. He built his cabin himself, fencing it in with cedar posts he'd cut from the draws. Years of hard sun and cold winters had weathered him into the sort of man who looked like he belonged to the land broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a face carved in quiet lines. Caleb wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't a talker either. He'd stop and tip his hat in greeting, maybe trade a few words at the feed store or over a whiskey at the saloon, but he never lingered. Most evenings found him back on his porch, watching the sun burn itself out over the horizon, his boots propped on the railing and a slow wind rustling the cottonwoods by the creek. There were women in Ash Hollow who took an interest in him, though none could say they knew him well enough to call it courtship. A few had tried bringing him pies, stopping by the ranch under the pretense of selling him eggs or milk, but Caleb always thanked them politely and sent them on their way. He wasn't cold about it, just distant, like a man who had drawn a line in the dirt around himself and decided no one else needed to cross it. In truth, he understood loneliness better than most. It wasn't that he liked it. It was simply what he knew. He'd lost more than a few things in his life, things he didn't care to speak about, and somewhere along the line, he decided that keeping to himself was easier than risking the kind of loss that could hollow a man out. So he worked his land, mended his fences, and counted the seasons by the way the grass changed color on the ridge. That September afternoon, he was driving a small herd along the old trail that ran the edge of Evelyn Graves' land. The sun was heavy and hot, pressing the scent of dust and mesquite into the air, the cattle lowing as they plodded forward. He meant to push them through the pass before nightfall, but as he crested the rise, the horizon darkened, not with the promise of evening, but with the heavy, swirling bruise of a storm. In the west, storms came fast and without kindness. The first low growl of thunder rolled over the hills, and Caleb's instincts told him to move quick. He pushed the cattle harder, but the wind came on like a wall, bending the grass flat. By the time the first cold drops hit his hat brim, lightning was cracking in the distance, too close for comfort. He looked around for shelter. The trail offered nothing but open ground and a scatter of mesquite trees, no good against lightning. His eyes landed on a familiar landmark, a long stretch of split-rail fence beyond which lay the widow in Black's land. He knew enough about her to know most men wouldn't dare cross her gates uninvited. But Caleb wasn't most men, and at the moment, He wasn't thinking about her reputation, just the fact that her barn was close enough to beat the worst of the storm. He guided his horse toward the fence, swung down, and unlatched the gate. The rain came harder now, pelting his shoulders. The barn loomed ahead, weathered but solid, the wide doors closed against the wind. He rode up, dismounted, and rapped his knuckles on the doorframe. For a long moment, there was no answer, only the sound of the rain hammering the roof and the hiss of wind through the eaves. Then the door opened just enough to reveal her, Evelyn Graves, framed in the dim light, her black hat casting a shadow over her eyes. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, and Caleb had the sudden, odd feeling that she was weighing him, not just in the way people measure a stranger's intentions, but as if she could see more than he was saying. "Storm's moving fast," he said simply, his voice steady. "Could use a dry place for the cattle and myself." Her gaze flicked past him to the herd, then back to his face. Another long pause. Finally, she opened the door wider. "Bring them in," she said, her voice low but clear, and that was how. Caleb Hart, quiet, solitary Caleb, came to be the only man in Ash, Hollow in more than a decade, to stand at the Widow in Black's door and be invited inside. The barn smelled of hay, rain, and horse sweat, the kind of scent that clung to a man's clothes for hours after he left. Caleb led his gelding inside, the boards creaking under their weight. Outside, the storm struck in full, rain drumming hard against the roof while the wind rattled the loose tin along the rafters. Lightning lit the world in quick, white flashes through the gaps in the boards, and each thunderclap rolled through the valley like a giant's footsteps. Evelyn had already moved toward the far stall. Opening it for his horse, she moved with a quiet efficiency, no wasted steps, no fuss. Caleb led the gelding in, uncinched the saddle, and gave the animal a quick rub down. He caught her watching him for a moment, her dark eyes unreadable, before she turned away and busied herself with pulling a pitchfork from the wall. Without asking, she began to lay down fresh hay. "Appreciate you letting me in," Caleb said, his voice carrying just enough over the storm. She didn't look up. Wouldn't make sense to let a man and his stock get struck out there. Storm. Like this, you're better under a roof, even mine. Caleb almost smiled at the way she said it. Like her barn was the last place on earth anyone wanted to be, but still preferable to death by lightning. "I've been in worse places," he replied. Removing his hat and shaking off the water dot, her gaze slid toward him briefly sharp, measuring and then away again. "That so?" she said, but it wasn't really a question. They worked in silence. For a while, the only sounds the shifting of the cattle outside, the hiss of rain, and the distant groan of thunder. Caleb found himself studying her in the lamplight. The black she wore looked less severe in here, more like it belonged to her, not a costume, but a part of her skin. She wasn't the ghostly figure the town painted her to be. There was strength in the way she stood, the set of her shoulders, the unshakable steadiness in her hands. And beneath it, there was something else, something he couldn't name yet. "You run this place alone?" he asked finally, nodding toward the stalls, the feed bins, the tools lined neat against the wall. She gave a short nod. "Always have." Then, after a pause, "Well, not always, but long enough." Her words held weight, the kind that hinted at a story she had no interest in telling to a man she barely knew. Caleb didn't press. He knew better than most that you couldn't pull truth out of someone by force. It had to be offered, and only when they were ready. The rain outside intensified, a heavy curtain that blurred the world beyond the barn doors. Caleb leaned against one of the support beams, folding his arms. "Town folks tell a lot of stories about you," he said evenly. Evelyn's mouth twitched, not a smile, more like the ghost of one. "They'd have to. Gives them something to talk about between births, deaths, and cattle drives. They say you're dangerous," that earned him a longer look. "And do you believe them?" He shook his head slowly. "Don't put much stock in other people's words. I like to see for myself." Something flickered in her eyes then, interest, maybe, or surprise. But just as quickly, her expression smoothed over. "Careful with that. Seeing for yourself can get you into trouble." "I've been in trouble before," Caleb said, his tone quiet but steady. For the first time, she let a small, genuine smile slip, though it was fleeting. "You don't seem the type." "And you don't seem the type to match the stories I've heard," he countered. She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "Then maybe you haven't heard the worst of them." "I don't need to," he said, meeting her gaze. "You're not what folks say you are." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the rain outside. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, really looked, and something in her seemed to shift, though she quickly masked it with her usual reserve. She turned away, busying herself with adjusting the latch on the stall door. When the storm finally began to ease, Caleb saddled his horse again. Evelyn walked him to the barn doors but didn't open them right away. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, the sky a muted gray. "Safe ride back," she said, and it almost sounded like she meant it. Caleb tipped his hat. "Thanks again for the roof." She gave him one last unreadable look, then slid the doors open. He rode out without looking back, but the image of her standing there in the dim barn light followed him all the way home. And though neither of them knew it yet, that storm had done more than soak the earth. It had cracked the first stone in the walls both of them had been living behind for years. By the time Caleb Hart rode into Ash Hollow 3 days later, the storm was already old news, but his choice of shelter during it was not. Gossip in a small frontier town traveled like prairie fire, fast, smoky, and leaving nothing untouched. It started in the saloon, where a ranch hand claimed he'd seen Caleb's herd grazing near the widow in Black's land just before the rain came down. By the next morning, the story had spread to the general store, the church steps, and the post office, except now, it wasn't just that Caleb had sheltered in her barn. Depending on who you asked, he'd been seen having supper with her, or he'd stayed the whole night under her roof, or most scandalously, she'd invited him inside her house. None of it was true, but truth was never what gossip traded in. It was built on suggestion, the kind you could deny with your mouth and still believe in your bones. When Caleb stepped off his horse in front of McCafferty's general store, he could feel the eyes on him. Men leaning against the hitching rail paused their conversation. 2 women coming out of the store cut their chatter short, glancing at him before hurrying away. Even old Tom at the hardware counter gave him a longer than usual look when Caleb came in for fence nails. He ignored it all. Or at least he told himself he did. Caleb had long ago learned that a man couldn't control what others said about him. The only thing he could control was whether or not he gave them the satisfaction of reacting. Still, it didn't take long for the whispers to find his ears. By the end of the week, the most common question floating around Ash Hollow was, why her? Some asked with curiosity, others with suspicion, and a few with outright contempt. One man in particular seemed to take Caleb's supposed interest in Evelyn Graves as a personal insult. Clint Broderick, owner of the largest cattle spread in the county. Broderick was a big man and more ways than one. Big land, big herd, big voice. He was used to getting what he wanted and had never forgiven Evelyn for refusing to sell her ranch to him years back. Rumor had it he'd made her an offer more than once, each time getting the same cold no for an answer. So when Broderick heard that Caleb had been on her land, he saw an opportunity not just to stir trouble, but to tarnish the woman who denied him. It started subtle. A loud comment in the saloon about a man losing his good sense if he spends too much time with certain women. A half laugh, half sneer about black dresses hiding black hearts. But Broderick was too. Much of a bully to stay subtle for long. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon outside the feed store. Caleb was loading sacks of grain into his wagon when he heard Broderick's booming voice behind him. "Careful there, Hart. Spend too much time with the widow and you might catch whatever it is that keeps her alone." The handful of men standing nearby chuckled. Caleb set the sack down, turned, and met Broderick's eyes. "You mean self-respect?" Caleb asked, his voice steady, carrying just enough for the others to hear. The laughter cut off. Broderick's face darkened, the easy humor replaced by a spark of something meaner. "You think you know her?" he said. "You don't. None of us do. That's the point. Woman like that, she's hiding something. Always has been." Caleb stepped closer, close enough that the difference in their sizes didn't matter. "Only thing I see her hiding from is men who think she owes them an explanation for living her life." The silence that followed was heavy. Broderick stared at him for a long moment, jaw tight, before turning away with a muttered curse. The onlookers shifted uneasily, some impressed, others wary. Caleb finished loading his wagon without another word, climbed onto the bench seat, and drove away. But as he left town, he caught sight of Evelyn on the far side of Main Street, coming out of the dressmaker's shop. She was carrying a small brown parcel, her head turned slightly as if she'd heard the exchange from across the street. Their eyes met for a moment long enough for Caleb to catch something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude. Exactly. Not approval either. More like recognition. That night, back at her ranch, Evelyn sat on her porch with the parcel unopened beside her. She thought of the way Caleb had faced Broderick, how he'd spoken as if her worth was a given, not something to be defended or explained, and though she would never admit it out loud, not yet something in her chest that had been locked tight for 10 long years shifted just a little. The wind came first. It swept down from the high country in sudden, violent gusts that rattled the dry cottonwoods and sent dust spinning across the flats. Caleb had been mending fence along his south pasture when he caught the first whiff of its smoke, faint but sharp, cutting through the dusty air. He straightened, scanning the horizon, and there it was, a thin black column curling upward from the northwest, toward the line of hills that marked the edge of Evelyn Graves' land. In summer, every rancher knew what that meant. Grass fire. He didn't think, he just moved. He unlatched his horse from the rail, swung into the saddle, and drove the animal hard toward the smoke. By the time he topped the ridge between his land and hers, the column had thickened into a smear, the wind tearing it sideways into a low, choking haze. He found Evelyn already in the pasture nearest the blaze, a wet bandana tied over her mouth, shoveling dirt onto a creeping tongue of fire. Her black dress was gone, replaced by trousers, boots, and a plain white shirt streaked with soot. Her hat brim was pulled low, shadowing her eyes, but he could see the strain in the set of her jaw. She didn't look surprised to see him. Maybe she'd expected him. Or maybe she'd just known the fire would draw every able hand within riding distance. Without wasting words, she tossed him a second shovel from her saddlebag. "Wind's shifting," she shouted over the roar. "If we don't cut it here, it'll jump the creek and eat the east pasture." Caleb nodded, set his bandana in place, and went to work beside her. The hours blurred into a single, unbroken motion: dig, throw, stamp, turn. The fire hissed and crackled, retreating in places only to surge somewhere else. Smoke stung their eyes, coated their throats. The wind carried burning bits of grass across the line they were trying to hold, forcing them to stamp out each ember before it took root. Somewhere behind them, he could hear the low, frightened bawling of cattle penned in the safe pasture. When the wind finally began to die, the flames slowed, starved of fuel. Together they pushed the last line back until it was nothing but blackened earth and thin tendrils of smoke rising into the evening sky. Caleb straightened slowly, every muscle in his back protesting. Evelyn had already pulled the bandana from Fam From Talumlumnus. We Federin had already pulled the bandana from Sum Fum Tolzum and Fum Sum Tonkantu. Her face, her skin flushed from heat and effort. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked almost unguarded. Not softer, exactly, but stripped of the distance she usually kept around herself. "Thank you," she said, and there was no formality in it, no polite reflex. Just 2 words spoken like they cost her something and were worth every cent. He tipped his hat, even though it was smeared with ash. "Wasn't about to let you fight this alone." They walked back toward her house together, leading their horses. The sky had gone deep purple, and the smell of char hung heavy in the cooling air. She poured water from the pump into a tin cup and handed it to him before filling her own. They stood on her porch in silence for a while, drinking, letting their breathing settle. Finally, she set her cup down and looked out toward the dark line of the hills. "My husband died out there," she said, her voice even, like she'd rehearsed the words 1,000 times in her head. "Fire like this, 12 years ago." Caleb didn't speak, just let her keep going. "We'd been married 6 months. He went out to cut a line, same as we did tonight. Wind shifted. Caught him between the fence and the creek." She paused, her gaze fixed on some far-off point in the blackened pasture. "I was the one who found him. After that, folks didn't know what to say to me. Some stayed away out of pity. Others whispered. Said it was bad luck to be around me, that I should sell and start over somewhere else." "And you didn't," Caleb said quietly. "No." Her jaw tightened. "This land's all I have left of him. Selling would have been like losing him twice." They let the quiet settle. Again. Out in the distance, a single coyote called, the sound carrying across the burned ground. Caleb set his cup on the porch rail. "For what it's worth, Evelyn, you're not bad luck." She looked at him then, her eyes dark in the fading light. "You don't know that. I know you just fought to keep this place standing. And I know you're still here when most would have given up years ago. That doesn't look like bad luck to me." Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but close. She glanced away and he let the moment rest. When he finally mounted his horse to head home, the night had gone still. The wind was gone, the stars out, the fire nothing but smoldering patches on the far ridge. And though the land smelled of smoke and loss, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something important had survived the blaze, something between them that hadn't existed before. Ash Hollow had a way of coming alive on Saturday afternoons. By mid-morning, wagons lined the main street from the livery to the post office. Women in sunbonnets browsed bolts of cloth in McCafferty's store. Ranch hands leaned against railings, with paper-wrapped sandwiches from the bakery, and children darted in and out of doorways, chasing one another through clouds of kicked-up dust. It was the sort of day Evelyn Graves usually avoided. Crowds meant whispers, stares, and the same faint shiver in the air she'd been feeling for 12 years, the unspoken agreement that she was someone to keep a respectful, wary distance from. But this time she had no choice. A replacement pump valve had finally arrived from Denver, and if she didn't pick it up herself, the cattle would be without fresh water before week's end. She was halfway down Main Street when she saw him, Clint Broderick, broad-shouldered and broad-mouthed, standing square in front of the post office with a cigar in his teeth. Even from a distance, she could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes when he spotted her, followed by the slow curl of a smirk. "Well now," he drawled as she came within earshot, his voice carrying just enough to pull in the ears of everyone nearby, if it ain't the widow in black, gracing us with her presence. She kept her chin level and her pace steady. She'd learned long ago that silence was the sharpest reply, but Broderick stepped forward, blocking her path. "Heard you had company during that storm," he said. loud enough that 3 men on the boardwalk turned to listen. Rancher by the name of Hart. Guess some men don't mind risking bad luck if it comes in a pretty enough package. He grinned, but there was a meanness under it, the kind that didn't care if it cut deep. The moment stretched. Evelyn felt the familiar heat in her chest, not anger exactly, but the old choking blend of shame and defiance she'd carried for so long. She opened her mouth to tell him to move aside, and then a voice came from behind her. "Funny, Caleb," Hart said, his tone even and clear. "I don't recall asking your opinion on who I spend my time with." Heads turned. Broderick's grin faltered. "Hart, I was just making conversation." "Conversation's one thing," Caleb said, stepping past Evelyn so he stood between her and Broderick. "Insults are another." Broderick's eyes narrowed. "You really think you know her?" Caleb didn't blink. "I know enough to say she's the finest woman in this town." He let that sink in, then added, without raising his voice but with a weight that carried down the street, "Beautiful." It wasn't said like a compliment tossed across a saloon. It was said like a fact carved into stone. And in that single word, something in the air shifted. The onlookers, shopkeepers, ranch hands, housewives stared not at Evelyn with their usual guarded curiosity, but at Caleb as though he'd just spoken aloud something they hadn't dared to admit. For Evelyn, the word didn't land the way she expected. It didn't make her blush or stiffen. Instead, it was like hearing her name after a long absence, as if she'd been invisible. For so long she'd nearly forgotten she existed in anyone's eyes but her own. Broderick tried to laugh it off. "Well, if you like your women, but—" Caleb cut him off, stepping in just close enough. "Careful, Broderick. You're about 2 words from saying something you can't take back." Silence. The kind that lets a man know the fight's gone out of the other side before it starts. Broderick muttered something under his breath, stepped aside, and disappeared into the post office. Caleb turned to Evelyn, tipping his hat. "Ma'am," he said simply, and then walked toward the livery without another word. She stood there. For a long moment, aware of the way people were still watching her, but it was different now. The stares weren't sharp or suspicious. Some even held the faintest trace of respect. When she finally walked into McCafferty's store to collect the pump valve, she realized her hands weren't shaking the way they usually did in town. She carried herself differently, not because Caleb had saved her, but because he'd said aloud what she'd almost forgotten was true, that she was still a woman, still worth looking at, still here. By the time she rode back to her ranch. That evening, the sun was setting in a wash of orange and gold over the blackened ridge where the fire had run weeks before. And for the first time in 12 years, Evelyn Graves let herself smile not for anyone else to see, but just for her.